I peeked through the curtains, maintaining a vigil. Here was yet another horde of individuals. They shuffled back and forth across my field of observational vision. No, it wasn't a zombie apocalypse. No virus had been unleashed to transform the masses into a threat for those surviving. It was a cell phone horde. In a way, yes, rendered just as brain-dead as a zombie, and inflicted with a virus of a kind, of the distorted electromagnetic variety. Were they a danger? To themselves, certainly. Even as I watched, several shuffled in front of cars. One fell down a storm drain, and still another's progress was halted by a wall, and yet he continued to walk against it, like one of those battery toys that will continue to march endlessly against something that obstructs its way. He was seemingly confused at the barrier that he didn't quite seem to recognize. And then, through the crowds came Lindsay, weaving her way precariously through the cell phone, clutching and vacant-faced people on the streets. I took my opportunity. I wrenched open the door, did a rather poor military roll that had me chased by a few irate wasps I had disturbed, then seized Lindsay by the arm and whisked her to safety. Before we made it to our refuge, for my own amusement, I exchanged one individual's mobile phone for a loose brick that was lying close at hand. Fascinated was I, watching as I sealed the doors, how the individual continued to tap at non-existent keys on the brick, a puzzled expression gradually forming on his face. Inside now, we all took our respective seats. My parents, Peter, Gwen, and I, their son, Kevin. Lindsay, my sister, sealed the curtains, blocking the view of the marauding cell phone afflicted. It was time again for more real-side dream recounting, and as was customary, I would begin. With the extent of dreams I was having that incorporated Lindsay, and how more receptive she seemed on the real side, it surely must be so that her personal self would be accepting it far more also. She was at least listening to the dreams we relayed. On this dream occasion, in the presence of the sometimes hard to impress Lindsay, I had taken it upon myself to demonstrate the malleable nature of the real side, and how less restricted we are there, and generally the more aware we become, the more we recognized this liberating aspect of life throughout creation. We were in a building, and I was putting on quite the show. Vanishing acts, manifestation feats, as I plucked all manner of artifacts from seemingly thin air, moving through what appeared to be solid structures that should have impeded my way, much like our zombie cell phone friend from the physical. Perhaps I should have sold tickets and added even more intrigue to the act to justify the selling of them, by pulling a reptilian from a hat, maybe, and having not just handkerchiefs up my sleeves, but an entire forest. During my display of creational manipulation, a curious addition to one of the walls became apparent. A peculiar little window. It was apparent Lindsay had not noticed it before either, as she indicated it now, and inquired as to its purpose. I had no answer for her, and had a sense that it really should not be here, even though windows were a rather regular feature of buildings. This one seemed out of place, as though it didn't sit right with the very wall it was a part of. A transparent window, as the best ones usually are, but nothing could be discerned through it, and Lindsay suggested I ought go and investigate. This was one of those situations where the expression of ladies first was overlooked, generally by the female, in the hair-raising situation, but always rather an adventurous individual. I elected to do just that, and satisfy our curiosities. I took the opportunity to add further to my all the exciting things you can do on the real side, but not on the physical show, and instead of clambering through it like one might on the physical, I chose to elevate myself and fly through it like a bird. Through the window I did go, and into whatever waited on the other side, and lay beyond. I landed neatly, and took in my surroundings. A dismal and uninviting scene, if ever I did see one. A dead, arid, and forbidding landscape I did behold. There was no sign of life. Rank odours assailed my nostrils. There was a sense of sinister undertones, and the ground was like a swampy marsh. So a great landing, yes, spoiled somewhat by the clinging bog that met my feet. So it was a window to what was more than likely, judging by my inhospitable environment, an area of the lower astral. Considering there seemed to be no aliens, beings, or much of anything to do besides get muddy and feel nauseous with the rank air that assaulted my nose, I decided to return to Lindsay, who was still waiting patiently. Or maybe not so patiently, patience not being one of her best attitudes, on the other side of the mysterious window. But I found my mobility seriously diminished. Yes, the ground was boggy, but not to the extent to explain this degree of immobilization. I looked to see if something had snared me, some vines, or maybe a fearsome mud octopus. Anything was possible. My inspection revealed no evidence of restriction, and yet my movements were drastically hampered, curiouser and curiouser. Every step seemed an effort. I felt like one of those old movie stop photography models created by the likes of Ray Harryhausen. I accepted my awkward predicament and made my way laboriously toward the window, but now something else was amiss. Some kind of transformation was overcoming me, a kind of darkness, and I was assuming a different form. I looked down at myself to see what I was becoming. Something dashing, I hoped, like a tiger, maybe, or a spectacular dragon. But my new body was not something that could be described as either, and certainly not something you'd see on the cover of a beauty magazine. Not only was my body vehicle hideously altered, but I had a stinker of an attitude now to match. Very malignant indeed. And yet still I proceeded, for what else was I to do? I was stopped in my tracks. Something else now was acting as a complete impediment to my mobility. A guide stood before me, standing between me and the window I sought to return to. I recognized him as a guide, but could not have identified him specifically. And he raised a hand and proclaimed I could go no further. My frightful form was not only maintained, it seemed to be becoming more unsightly with each passing moment. My attitude also deteriorating to the extent that all I could muster from my mutated maw were hisses and spits of outrage. Unperturbed by all this, the guide explained how I could not return to Lindsay in this current state of form and being, for to do so would pose a danger and threat to her. That said, he began to reverse the process I had undergone. I was transitioned back and restored to my former self. The foul attitudes dropped away, and thus I was granted my leave and allowed to return back through the window, and Lindsay's safety was assured. In fact, she'd probably bend my ear over how long I had been. We would never rendezvous, however, as here the dream would conclude. But just before I awoke, the guide conveyed one more piece of information to me. He warned me to beware of the dark reptilians. I explained to Lindsay now how I was once again sharing with her and encouraging her on the real side with my magic show, that it might filter through, and her personal self accept it all more readily. If we stumble upon homes and houses on the real side, these usually represent an individual's personal constructed self and vehicle, so attached to their personal self that they will create homes on the real side, and it is often how we may encounter them. So I would surmise the house was Lindsay's personal self, and the fact she had been receptive to my sharings was demonstrated, as she had let me inside, and that was where my magic display had been made. On a few occasions I have entered people's homes or personal selves on the real side, and been attacked by the individual as they construed it as an invasion of their personal self, their little self resistant to the sharings of the all is and the new. I gave Lindsay a suspicious glance to tease her, suggesting that, could it be that she was an agent of the dark forces, or at least affiliated with them, as this window to the lower astral and my plight did then manifest in her house. She pulled a face, and she reminded me of how in the dream she had been as perplexed as I as to the window's origins. I came back at her, pointing out that individuals can be programmed by the dark forces and work on their behest at life levels that, unless the individual has the awareness to recognize, would not realize, and that they were possibly an unwitting agent or that they were being manipulated without their personal knowledge. Unless people do make the connection to their real awareness, then they can become Callum pawns and used as one might a Manchurian candidate, those programmed to carry out assassinations, yet have no recollection of the assassination program they harbour until it occurs. Like in the Matrix movie, where anyone still locked in the Matrix can at any time become an agent, irrespective of whatever role they occupy in society, or whose sibling or daughter they may be. The window may have been a part of Lindsay's unconscious that she didn't recognise, or her connection to it. Naturally, as an adventure seeker, I flew through the window and got myself in a spot of bother. But, well, everything is an experience for our awareness, and that was my excuse. Like anybody in creation, we are a product of our environment, whatever each lifetime entails. We become associated with it and agree to it. And so, in this situation, I began to transform, becoming a product of the environment there. It afforded a good viewpoint for me and my awareness. That can be the case with family members. We are more agreeable to their suggestions, and we can drag ourselves into all kinds of entanglements. Things can get a little funny between family members, particularly on the physical and lower life levels. This is where engaging being to being is preferable, with indifference more so than emotion. We can go through this for lifetimes, and this is what can keep dragging us all back. We can have all kinds of experiences, and with the guides, but all it takes is one attitude, and usually it's a relationship of some description. And if we do take a part in another's experience, we become the product of their environment. Better we let family members have their position. We don't need to agree to it. Far better to agree with the is. Being to being is best, and better to let people go through their own experiences, and realistically, we cannot assist others. We can make suggestions, like the guide did with me. Then it's up to the recipient to accept the advice or not, and my heeding of his words had me transformed back. I was willing, but if I was not willing, the guide could not have transformed me, and I'd have pulled the attitude back through with me. Lindsay was throwing a piece of popcorn at me for every word I uttered now. I was beginning to form the impression that she didn't like what I was currently saying. The popcorn bombardment ceased as I spoke about the window instead. How by agreeing to go through the window, I had in essence suffered the cause and effect consequences of agreeing to something not in my best interests, demonstrated by finding myself in the predicament that I had. We have our real awareness that, if connected to, will allow us better to handle situations on the real side and on the physical. But if that fails, or the awareness is lacking, that we become unstuck, or very much stuck, as in my case here, then the guides are always near to lend a hand. I was able to recognize the guide and heed his counsel, whereas an average person may not have done so, and returned with the foul adopted attitude, to where Lindsay wasn't recognizing this unconscious connection also. For who knows what may have happened should I have returned through the window in such a state? And I dismissed Lindsay's suggestion that I could be Godzilla's next movie rival, or do my own spin-off show, The Adventures of Kevin Swampy Smith. Just to tease her a little further, I mentioned how a few months ago Gwen, Peter, I, and Lindsay were targeted for capture by reptilians, that only the New You song kept at bay, preventing them manifesting on the physical and executing their kidnapping plan. A smug grin, as Lindsay's eyes seemed to incorporate her entire face momentarily. At the time, I had the impression these were a special variety of reptilian, like Special Branch, Secret Assassins, or reptilian FBI special agents, called upon for more serious undertakings, and that these dark reptilians the guide referred to in this latest experience were the same group, and quite possibly the part of the astral I was in may well have been their territory. Adopting a sarcastic tone, and not making effort to disguise it, Lindsay enquired if the reptilians have postmen, milkmen, and a soccer team too. Going along with this, I suggested it far more likely they would have an intergalactic basketball team. They were rather tall in their stature after all. Unless, that is, they found themselves up against a team comprising of the tall silent ones, beings who were with the ears, and made a reptilian look diminutive, with all 10,000 feet of them. Lindsay would inquire now if any other people known to me on the physical level had featured in any dreams of late. Had they also been enticing me into dangerous environments, leading me into troll caves, dragon lairs, or Black Friday supermarkets? I'm not sure any degree of awareness could have ensured my safety in the latter. Give me fire-breathing dragons and skull-crushing trolls any day of the week. But yes, a friend of mine had been present in a dream recently, an individual who I have known for much of this lifetime, and probably many previously, as we all tended to be dragged back into creation by our affiliations and emotional associations. He has complete disregard for the new presentation, but alas, he must endure my endless speaking of it, and all things related, should he choose to be in my presence. Lindsay pointed out that perhaps this was the reason why the few friends I did have were seldom in my presence. Quite possibly, and there seemed no greater a deterrent than the mention of reptilian earth rulers and intergalactic happenings. I'd keep that in mind. Might be an invaluable tool for repelling people I didn't want in my midst. The dream would unfold an unremarkable setting, but the environment my friend and I were in seemed of little concern, as we were seeking something. And no, my friend was not seeking to evacuate the scene for fear of my rantings on all things otherworldly. What we sought, we would then locate, unlike on the physical level then, where the chances of finding a keepsake we have misplaced is as easy as finding a needle in an unlimited multiverse of dimensional haystacks. It was a crashed UFO, and it was half embedded in the ground. Not exactly on a par with the Roswell incident, as one element set it apart from any other UFO crash scene, and that was the minuscule nature of its dimensions, as it looked almost like a child's toy in its size, but it was real enough. A little hatch was opened, and as we peered inside, we could determine no sign of any occupants. But our eyes were met by banks of flickering lights and arrays of control panels. So it seemed the owners of said craft were not only bad pilots, but had abandoned ship and left the door open. But there was no danger of us occupying the ship and flying it around the cosmos. We could barely squeeze a hand inside. We began to scout the area in search of whomever or whatever had vacated their spaceship. Our hunt led us to a hillside where there was a slight depression, and standing there were two mini people that had to be the craft occupants. On inspection, they appeared very human. A little disappointing, I must say. I always did delight in my encounters with all things alien. They were as small as you might imagine, approximately an inch in height, and the most curious feature was how slowly they seemed to move, almost imperceptible to the eye. I'd known work colleagues to move faster, and that was saying something, if you did but know the efficiency of my work associates. Communication with them proved difficult. They were practically inaudible, and I imagine we were deafening them with our mouths, that they both could have sat comfortably in. They did manage to impress upon us the importance of some curious vials of amber liquid, and seemed to want to surrender them into our keeping. The vials, although small, were of similar size to the little people, and they had been dragging them from the ship to this hillside. We accepted and took possession of these vials, and regarding the tiny people, this was the last we would see of them. They had no further part to play in this dream. Establishing the vials did not contain Venusian beer, much to my lover of alcohol friend's dismay. I wanted to reveal the vials to the world, for in fact they represented somehow great knowledge, wisdom, or teachings, despite seemingly just being containers of amber fluid. My friend, however, had other ideas. He insisted we bury them, and reluctantly I agreed. and thus we concealed them in the ground, overlaying the place where they were buried with brickwork. The scene then would change, and I was in a future setting, and a very dull, dismal setting indeed. It had a very tired and washed out feeling about it, almost as though the very planet could no longer be bothered. There was I, sat in a bar, and consuming whiskey at an extortionate rate of $90 or 60 English pounds a shot. So not just a dismal future, but an expensive one at that. What followed was a series of scenes where I was reacquainted with my friend from earlier, and we seemed to be always in the company of groups of assorted people. In keeping with the dullness of this world, these people also ranged from boring to wanting to jump off a tall building tedious. As my boredom tolerance threshold was reached, and no more levels of boredom could I tolerate and endure with one group, I would warp from my position, teleporting and passing through the very building that the group of dreariness were occupying, much to their surprise, and maybe possibly stimulating a more interesting topic of conversation, only then to find myself with another group that more than matched the previous one for monotony. This continued on unceasingly, and I pronounced and declared this the most dreary planet, dimension, and life position ever likely to be recorded in the universal files. And then, thankfully, the dream ended. Lindsay waited patiently for an explanation, and I would explain how there were many viewpoint perspectives that could be brought to bear. When it came to size on the real side, sometimes we make the mistake of assuming just because someone appears vast that it is an indication of their real awareness, and this can be so, but many times the experience is demonstrating itself to where an oversized person is looking down on you, and that's the personal self. Again, it's people being the product of their environment. People go to school, get a string of qualifications and an alphabet of letters after their name, and they become the know-it-alls. And always there are the scientists with all their discoveries, and so everybody is self-convinced and easy to manipulate. The little people may have represented then our little personal selves, and my friend and I were the real selves, exemplified by our greater stature. But why, then, were the little, unaware, personal selves handing the vial of knowledge, which surely was the sharings of the ears, over to the real selves? Lindsay remarked that perhaps the little people couldn't open the vials, that the bigger real selves had tightened the lids to the extent it was beyond the strength of the mini personal selves to budge. An amusing view, but perhaps the journey was too much and monumental for the personal self at that moment, and they were rebuking the opportunity. And then the real us were burying it, symbolically demonstrating that even though the chance had been passed over, the memory of it was still buried in the subconscious. The seed was planted. It was now a memory, forever locked in the causal body, that should the opportunity be available again, the recognition would maybe ignite, and the interest sparked back into life. The other view could be that, in fact, it was the other way around. The little people were the real selves, and the big people the personal selves. And why the little selves were so very vast in comparative scale to their real selves was a reminder of how the convinced personal self can think it knows better than life itself, believing in its mind to be bigger than life. And there's the real self trying to get the attention of the personal self that is so big in its self-convictions it can't even hear or be aware of what life is demonstrating always. Whichever way you go with, the opportunity rejected resulted in the kind of dreary future lifetimes revealed in scene 2 of the dream, more unconscious lifetimes in a steadily deteriorating creational matrix with uninspiring company and expensive whiskey. Seemed I was playing with creational manipulating ability through my warping to escape unparalleled levels of boredom, but dabbling with what would be then psychic sciences and utilizing the ethereal vehicle would ensure further my remaining in creation, as it stacked up still further cause and effect to have to experience. Lindsay felt that my friend would have been happy enough in such a world, providing there was a constant supply of alcohol products. It was true. he had little interest or concern in anything beyond satiating his carnal desires and bare requirements, and perhaps his presence in my lifetimes was an influence I ought be wary of. In fact, I had other dreams presenting clear warnings to not allow him to trespass too readily into my life. We often had dreams of this nature, advice and suggestions, by way of real-side experiences that we either heeded or we did not. For these friendships we have, if they are not being to being, if they are associations on the physical level, then we can drag each other back into future lifetimes through the emotional attachments we have with them. To dispel Lindsay's accusation of my abandoning friends just because they no longer were aligned with my journey, I had to assure her that every individual had a version of themselves, a vehicle on each of the 5 life levels, and better still, a real self in the real universes that animated all the other, less aware vehicles. Far better to continue on with our process and encounter them in the real universes from a position of being to being, in the full glory of their being-isness, than here in the passing dream, in a dull world, and sipping whiskey laced with poisons, fluoride, and who knew what else. Lindsay wondered if my friend would maybe follow me into the real universes, and I pondered about tricking him into doing so. Maybe I could convince him there were endless bars that spanned light years, and the drinks served by scantily dressed females. Or maybe he could assume the form of a bottle of whiskey. That way he would constantly have alcohol inside himself. Yes, that was a possibility. I decided to share one final dream before handing the baton over to Peter, and it was another robot-orientated experience. Why I chose this dream was that Lindsay accompanied me on the excursion, and it was always good for her to realise that despite her reluctance to fully embrace what we were sharing, she still was a part of a number of our adventures. And this dream would have she and I pay a visit to what appeared to be a planet junkyard, not the kind of place one would book a vacation at, very uninspiring, and unenviable a location. Nothing organic seemed to exist here, not even a hint of greenery, or even a weed struggling through the junk and debris. There was life of a kind, only not the natural kind, for robots seemed to be the only animated expression of existence here. Every type, description, and size imaginable of robot did maraud over this desolate world, mechanically clunking their respective ways through this stark and cold place. Lindsay was along for the experience, as I said, and wasn't up to anything funny, like trying to encourage me to investigate windows that led to hell realms, as an example. If she pointed out another window or portal that I ought investigate, I may well have slapped her about the head with a dismembered robotic limb. For yes, robot parts scattered the environment, evidence of turmoil, and robot battles were apparent. How disappointing to find everywhere you went that always there were quarrels, bickering, altercation, and wars. But not entirely unsurprising, as we took the moment to observe the array of robots that wandered in our vicinity. Seems they were unaware of us. Perhaps then we were operating on a level beyond their ability to perceive us. Just as well, I didn't want to be embroiled in a robot scuffle, with the evident and unceasing conflict that these robots seemed to pass away their days with. I was very much reminded of the old comics and animations of Earth, that of the Zoids, and many of these robots did have a similar appearance and flavour to them. The Zoids, as indeed these robots, were based on actual animal designs. There was one particular robot who was constructing its own little army. It would trundle about in the aftermath of battle, gather up all the remains like a scavenger, and take them to a secure location. Once there, it would reconstruct robots from the debris as best as it was able, and they would be loyal to their creator and do its bidding, as they would be reprogrammed into obedience. Thus it had its own personal robot army, not the most glorious and resplendent robots, to be sure, but effective enough, it would seem. This world then had its own metallic version of the Frankenstein story. the scene did switch rather suddenly, and to a completely different setting. No longer was I in the robot world, and Lindsay now absent from my side. Now I was with Gwen, my mother. I was setting her a mission, a task. She was to gather and collate information on the reptilians. The nature of the information I requested was unclear, but she willingly accepted her assignment and executed it admirably. She far exceeded my expectations. Who'd have thought my aging mother would make such a fine spy and secret reptilian-defying agent, and hurl herself into such dangerous undertakings? She returned, laden with information, her arms full with details, and photographic evidence, to the extent I could just see the top of her head over the bundles of files and papers. She had information regarding the reptilians' devious plots and skullduggery, their anti-human intentions and machinations. But to be fair, she also had information of the reptilians who had taken a new stance, of the opposite inclination, those assisting now and helping the humans and wishing to become more aware. For even they were weary of creation, and with the Orion royalty removed, they were choosing new positions for themselves, and the looming prospect of the Phantom Zone was certainly an incentive to do this also. With Gwen's mission a success, one thing remained. We were going to reveal this information to the world. All would hear of this. The great humanity wake-up would begin. And this is where the dream concluded. So, once again, I am on my adventures, and earning my way through the experiences I have, the worlds I explore, and the individuals I encounter and interact with. Through this, then, I become more and more aware, until I am no longer the effects of my unawareness. Lindsay wasn't entirely convinced a robot would care much for what I was presenting, and possibly not, but nevertheless individuals still inhabited the vehicles, metallic they may be, and their real selves still resided with the is, waiting to be connected with. Many dreams I had were robotic and reptilian in nature. Maybe one day I'd have a culmination and meet my first robotic reptilian. But again, another robot world? Was it a dimensional happening at this moment? Was it a glimpse into the future of this soon-to-be robotic world, as we were going down a mechanical path for certain? We already have what they term smart appliances. Are these to be smarter than the humans who made them? It's arguable they already are. Lindsay remarked how maybe it was all in my head. I pictured a robot version of Lindsay then. Would there be enough mechanics to construct her ever-flapping, mighty mouth? It was dubious. The robots were individuals who were so self-convinced, so rigidly literalized, that layers upon layers of self-limiting rigidity through limiting awareness constricting life choices had resulted in them becoming frozen and positioning themselves as robotic beings. And even then they still were fighting, still doing everything that had resulted in their current circumstances, and adding still further layers to their created consciousnesses. How much more rigid might they become? What possible vehicles could equal that which they have decided upon? Was there a life position and vehicle that reflected a level of constriction even more so than a robot? What would be next? How would you top that? A stationary robot? A kitchen appliance? Maybe a refrigerator? Would an individual spend a lifetime being used to whisk up eggs or open cans of beans? It was wise to be careful with how self-convinced we become, or end up becoming a toaster someday. The only risk-taking available for you then would be to make defiantly burnt bread. I suggested that I had invited Lindsay along for the robot world trip to impress upon her personal little self the potential and possible future lifetime that awaits all who continue down the road of self-limitation and agreed upon restriction, due to the embracing of the awareness constricting ideas others had created. Such an eye-opener might encourage her to look again at the new presentation and its sharings. Nothing like a shocking experience of this ramificational nature to spur such consideration. Lindsay wasn't impressed as to how I'd roped Gwen into such a dangerous mission. She pointed out her age, her frailty, her inability to move with efficiency. How could she do such a mission and escape the hands of the reptilians? At that point, Gwen may have used a frying pan for purposes other than which it was intended for. But I assured all that on the real side, any physical restrictions were absent, and so even Gwen could be a super agent and defy even the most hardiest of scaly adversary. Lindsay accepted this, and Gwen's frying pan was lowered as I continued to explain how Gwen was willing to partake of experiences too, to go through her process, to become more aware and earn her awareness. For certain, her mission was fraught with peril, and she undoubtedly had all manner of reptilian entanglements, I have no doubt. Maybe we would learn of her daring exploits in the unfolding weeks to come. Our missions and adventures afford us a better understanding of what the world really consists of. It's not just mountains, hills, freeways, but what is it that is behind all this surface world? To see it for what it is, beyond the pretense. It's quite the adventure to get through all of creation, or we remain self-absorbed and we repeat the same routines again. Everybody can get through all these layers of self-conviction if they take the opportunity offered, and all the experiences can be an asset once recognized properly as a reference, and chiefly as reference for what not to do. Thus we take the risk and step in and do whatever is necessary to have the experience to see that also. Objectively, then, we can decide what we don't want, to sort everything out, and recognise the real you to a better and better degree. And with that, it was time for Peter to continue with his experiences. Gwen was keeping her frying pan on standby. Lindsay had cancelled the order for the exciting new microchip that would allow better cell phone interaction, and so the unnerving robot future had had the impact I was hoping for.
Lindsay looked at me and I began. For some reason, buses seem to figure somewhat in my dreams lately. I dreamed recently that I was on one, probably a single-decker this time. At any rate, I was sitting at street level. I noticed the windows were all very dirty, so much so that you could not see out of them, all except the one I was sitting next to, which was quite clear. Unusually, the window could, it seems, be opened, and for some reason I decided to slide mine down and promptly closed it again. Now it too was filthy dirty, and I could no longer see out, to my annoyance. Dwayne's take on this was that While still being in the physical, I can see things nobody else can. In addition, I was, if I wanted, able to jump out of the window and go a different way to the others, which is very interesting. In another recent dream, I was in a house. It was about 6 a.m. and I heard the doorbell go, though somewhat half-heartedly in volume. I went to the door, still in my pyjamas. There stood an old lady in a somewhat distraught state. Apparently she was a neighbour, but I did not recognise her. She asked me if I could come and help her little grandson. In what way was not stated. I agreed and turned to go and get dressed. There it ended. Here Dwayne said this indicated the real guides were checking if I was willing to help somebody, and also it was a way of getting me out of the house, that is, leaving the personal side, as a house always symbolises our personal vehicle or self. A lot of your dreams seem to be in houses. Don't you ever have any outdoor ones, even exciting ones? Well, I don't know about exciting ones. Kevin seems to have the monopoly on them. One outside one did occur recently, though. Go on, thrill us. Well, I was in a wooded area, but rather than lush greenery, it had a decidedly dead look about it. The ground was brown with dead leaves, but there was no green anywhere, not even grass. The trees were fairly well spaced and leafless. None I could see was more than 9 inches to a foot thick. I felt a growing atmosphere of menace and sensed something dangerous was approaching. I decided to climb up a tree. The branches were clearly dead and crackled when I put any weight on them. They must have been under severe strain. Thank you. Looking down, I suddenly saw a woman below. Not another old lady. Well, yes, but I knew this one. It was the mother of Laurie, who works with me. Oh, Steve's widow. That's right. I called down to her to warn her of the impending danger, and broke off a branch and threw it down to her for possible self-defence. Though I hope I would have climbed down to help her if needed, but the dream ended before I could find out. Here Dwayne mentioned the old expression to be up a tree, meaning to be in trouble, and boy are we in trouble. Yet nobody seems to be doing anything about it. It was all really a wake-up call. Don't you ever dream about younger ladies? Funnily enough, the last one I wanted to talk to you about this evening was exactly that. Oh yes, do we want to hear this? It's harmless enough, though I found it somewhat disconcerting. Go on. I'd been invited, it seems, to attend some kind of get-together of the new you folk. I found myself in a big hotel. I felt it was in the USA. I was, I suppose, in the lobby, and found myself walking through large open doors into a large ballroom or similar, where I could see several men and women, about a dozen, I suppose. I didn't recognise anybody. Dwayne wasn't there then? No, I did scan them in, but none of them were familiar from the new U-book pictures, or indeed were the girls. The men all wore smart, grey, modern-style three-piece suits, but the girls were all in magnificent, colourful long dresses, all reaching to the floor, and of rather old style. They looked like the kind of dresses the women always wear in westerns. All the girls had dark hair and were quite beautiful. However, none of these people gave me a second glance, as they stood around doing nothing in particular, just really standing there. I felt like the spectre at the feast. Then they turned their backs on me and swiftly exited. All but one. A girl at the back of the group suddenly spun round, laughing pleasantly, and said, "Hello, Peter." I then recognised her as a girl I used to work with 40-odd years ago. She lifted one side of her dress up to the knee, revealing a white stocking, and with that she was gone. I woke up rather confused. So what was Dwayne's reaction to all this? Firstly, that white symbolised purity. The foot and knee represented the physical body. He then asked me how I was dressed in the dream. I didn't really know, but assumed I was exhibiting my usual total lack of sartorial elegance. We sometimes need to wear so-called uniforms to conform to things we wish to belong to, he continued, like in a football team. What can he have meant by that? There was a certain element of sarcasm in her tone. I said myself it suggested no riff-raff, but he didn't take me up on that. I suppose it was better not to pursue it. In the end, I think what he was saying was that it was me, not the other people, who thought I wasn't good enough. We decided to call it a day at that point.